What kind of world do I want to live in? I think about this question a lot.
For our generation and for specifically my group of people, which is refugees, the circumstances might dismantle any vision of the future that we have.
You're trying to rebuild, you're trying to make a future for yourself, and then the climate-related disaster comes and you start again. It's not about how it's affecting you now, it's about how it's affecting you your entire life.
First step to understand is that we're all a part of it. None of us are going to be left out by the crisis.
We're at a stage where if we don't act now, really there won't be very much left.
There are generations that will never see certain things that we grew up seeing in real life.
We have to start treating this like the emergency it is. To achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we have to go from an intention to a serious commitment.
Business leaders really need to rethink how they conduct their business and invest in creating systems that are climate friendly.
The action I would like to see is accountability. Structures being put in place where countries aren't just asked to do something, but they're kept accountable to the decisions that they make.
There has to be that strong collaboration between government, between corporations, between youth activists to drive change forward.
The world I would want to live in is a world where imagining the future is not a privilege.
I want to live in a world where people do not give up on hope that a positive change is possible.
The fact that you're listening today means that you are willing to make a change.
Well, that was a nice snapshot of the different voices around. Well, that was a nice snapshot of the different voices around the world. The next generation, if you will, the Gen Zers, were very active on the issue we're tackling today. I'm John Defterios, joining you from Dubai, and welcome to our session, Building Tomorrow's Energy Systems. As you know, it's part of the World Economic Forum's Sustainable Development Impact Summit. Our timing for this roundtable discussion could not be better, right in the midst of the United Nations UNGA and the package that's taking place in the General Assembly and the discussions around this topic, and also about 5 weeks ahead of COP26 in Glasgow. As I noted, I'm joining you from Dubai today, and yesterday, in the last 24 hours, chaired 3 sessions around hydrocarbons, with ministers from very large emerging markets. And I think the thing that came out of it for me, what stood out, is that we're living in a bipolar world. And I don't mean to be cute here, but you have the developed countries, primarily in the West, the United States and Europe, laying out very clear strategies to net zero by 2050, collaboration between the government and the capital markets, lots of investment flowing into this sector of the world. And then the developing world, the ministers I spoke to from Bangladesh and Nigeria, Indonesia, very populated developing countries, saying for the next decade, they're kind of wedded to hydrocarbons because they have these assets, they're lower cost, oil and gas as a transition fuel. They'd like to go in a deeper way to renewable energy, but they're hamstrung by finance. So one of the topics here in our session today is this green fund really going to come to reality, be robust, and be long-term so these governments and companies around the world in the developing world can make plans? We're going to have a 40-minute session here. We welcome your comments. Put them into the chat box, and I'd like to have your location and name, if you'd like to as well, to pepper to our panel. Let me introduce them now. First, the Deputy Secretary of Energy. Joining us from Washington is David Turk. John Moore is the Chief Executive Officer of Bloomberg NEF. He joins us from the UK. Ignacio Galán is the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Iberdrola. And Judith Hartmann is Executive Vice President and CFO of the French energy giant Engie. A nice World Economic Forum. Welcome to all of you. Before I get a chance to begin our questioning, I wanted to bring up a slide here of a word cloud and a key question that we'd like to have you weigh in, put in your input to how you see COP26 coming forward. How would you define a great success from COP26 in Glasgow? What are your expectations to come in the next 5 weeks in this 12-day meeting that's taking place? We'll bring that slide up and then bring it up a little bit later to see those in the audience who have weighed in as well. And in fact, I would like to start with the Deputy Secretary, David Turk. David, we saw some progress in the last 24 hours. And in fact, the last 48 hours, we had the UN Secretary General at the General Assembly say, look, we need to move in a much more rapid way and consolidate the gains we've had so far and move further. We heard Boris Johnson, who is the president of COP26 as a country, the Prime Minister of the UK again. And also we've had President Biden weigh in, and then China suggesting it won't export any more coal plants. That's kind of late in the process. What kind of progress did we make? And very importantly, how do you consolidate it around COP26?
Well, let me start, John, with a thank you for moderating, and thank you to our WEF colleagues for bringing us all together. And it's terrific to be on a panel with such leaders like Ignacio, Judith, and John. And so I'm going to try to keep my comments short so that I can listen to them and learn from them as well. I think it is true, as we look at where we're at, that we have made progress. We've made a lot of progress, and not only in the last few days, but in the many months and years before that. We at the Department of Energy and the U.S. government focus a lot on technology and technology costs. And it's quite remarkable what we've been able to do. The U.S., countries around the world, private sector leaders around the world, really reducing those costs so that we can do things at scale. We can do solar PV at scale. We can do wind at scale. But we need to keep reducing those costs further. So one of the key priorities for us is, and I think this helps everybody's ambition. It helps political leaders' ambition in terms of NDC contributions. In the Paris Agreement, it helps companies make ambitious pledges going forward as well, is even on solar. We've seen solar PV costs be reduced dramatically over recent years, but we're going to keep pushing those costs down. So our goal is to reduce those costs another 60%. We're trying to reduce costs for hydrogen. Green hydrogen gets a lot of attention. We're trying to reduce those costs for green hydrogen to $1 per kilogram in this decade. Electricity storage, especially long duration storage, such an important part of the equation as we get higher and higher intermittent renewables penetration into our grids. We've got goals to reduce those costs 90% for that long duration storage over 10 hours. So as we focus on the political commitments, including the one that my president put on the table in terms of international finance, other commitments that are being made and will be made in the Paris Agreement, Let's focus on where the progress is on the technology side, which helps everybody, frankly, and helps everybody be more ambitious as well.
Okay, I want to talk to you about some of those technologies that are in place today and kind of the moonshots of tomorrow. Let's bring up the Slido and the word cloud here and see what the initial indications are from our audience. Again, we welcome the questions coming in, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. I know we have a slight delay, and we'll pose a question at the same time here. John Moore, investments into hydrocarbons tracking for the last 5 years, very close to about $1 trillion. They dipped down prior to the pandemic in anticipation of this investment into renewables. But the renewable investment worldwide, if you factor in electric vehicles, about $500 billion. What needs to happen with that gap to get to net zero by 2050?
Yeah, I mean, so thank you very much for having me on. It's really great to share some thoughts. And so actually, there's been an increase in investment over the last few years, up to that $500 billion. And again, depending on how you measure it, what you will see is that sort of on a private basis into fossil fuels, we think there's about $700 billion per annum going into that support. And on a private G20 level, there's about another $700 billion. So you have a sort of $1.4 trillion going into fossil fuels. You have $500 billion flowing into renewables. So essentially, what needs to happen over time is a transition towards, from fossil fuels into renewables. And by our numbers, what we think is that to get near to Paris, the $500 billion needs to be between 1 and 1.5 over the next decade, and then it needs to go up again, sort of 2 or 3 times to between $2 and $4 trillion per annum. So it has to scale, but these are into technologies by then that would be proven. So hopefully we see an acceleration but we really need to get moving this decade to see that swing from fossil fuels into renewables and other clean technologies.
Ignacio Galan, that sounds overly ambitious, what John's talking about here. And these are the facts of how to get to the targets that are set out, not for the developed world, but globally, right? Is that feasible in your view in some of the markets that you're working in here that are suffering from underinvestment, and why the Green Fund that President Biden committed to yesterday is so important?
So first, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. So I'm always optimistic. I think today more than 180 countries signed the Paris Agreement. So the civil society is present to make changes. And I'm confident that some progress is going to be made already in Glasgow in the COP26. So I think I'm in the sector since 20 years. And I think the situation is very different today than what it was at that time. Many government regulators, competitors were not convinced about the need of fight against climate change. Today, that is not the situation. So I think we in Iberdrola, we've been already moving ahead since then. I think we have invested heavily, so 140 billion in renewables, electricity, networks, storage, all those things we documented today. And we transform the company in things with everybody agrees now. But I think my first point is, as John Kerry says, is we need to accelerate. I think the sense of urgency, most of the things have to be done during the decade. If we are not already move rapidly, we will not reach our goals. We have to invest massively in renewables, smart grid, and storage. And I think, as David was commenting, we have the technology, we have the skill, we have the financial resources. But we need things which are not dependent. It's dependent on the administration, faster permitting processes. It still continues 4, 5, 6 years to obtain a permit for making anything. So either for renewable, either for networks. I think it's almost impossible in most countries. Clear and stable framework. I think I insist on that one for many reasons. I will comment later on. Tax policies, applying the principle who pollutes pay. So we cannot change the rules anytime because already temporary situation. We cannot jump from subsidizing renewables to penalizing them just because of temporary situation of the global community prices. We have to be very consistent with investment that mature over 40, 50, 60 years. So I think there are already rules. I think it's in the European Union, it's already clear path about carbon neutrality with the Green Deal and Fit for 55 law. But I think now, because of this temporary situation, some countries is penalizing already this clean energy. So I think there are situations which is absolutely crazy. We are moving that today. They are already paying gas-fired power plants 20 euros per megawatt hour, coal 60 euros megawatt hour, and wind, hydro, or nuclear between 80 and 100 euro megawatt hour. That is not already considered, just because of the temporary situation. And that is my concern. That put the European model at risk. The Commission cannot stay apart. It needs to take action to make the Fit for 55 will be a reality. ETS is not a new model. It's a model that was already developed 15 years ago. Everybody knew that the carbon price is going to increase. Now they are discovering that the prices, because it's increasing, it is affecting to the price of energy. But everybody knew that is already what they had decided for them. So I have to say the opposite about United States. The United States, we are already, we have very important president in this country, like 25 states, 40 billion invested. So, and I think United States has already the same regime based in tax incentive for 15 years, no change, independent of the change of the federal authorities. And that is, the result is they are more renewable here than elsewhere. And they're already extending this model as well now for networks. So I think, but as well, here they have the same problem about permitting, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for me, the concern is if we would like to convince another countries to follow our path, American and European path. So we have to be very consistent, stable, and transmit the sense of urgency. We cannot change the rules at the middle of the way just because of temporary situation of the gas price. That is a disaster. We cannot convince countries you mentioned before, because that what is about you? You change the things because it's a temporary situation. I think for completing my point is consistency, stability, sense of urgency, and not change the rules because of temporary situation we can affect to the temporary prices of electricity.
Yes, I know you're making reference to the gas price hikes we're seeing here in the European Union, in particular the UK. It's been topping headlines this week. As a result of this, Judith, it seems to me we're in that space in between, right, in the transition. There was some underinvestment. We drew down inventories of gas because of the longer winter last year. We had that price squeeze, but there's been underinvestment in hydrocarbons and not enough renewable energy to fill the gap yet. Is that how you see it? And this is the reality of the transition? It will be painful at different times and consumers will pay higher prices?
No, I think, John, it's great to see you, first of all, and great to see the rest of the panelists. What you just talked about, I think, is a great proof that energy is two things. You have to have some long-term thinking, and you need to have a balance. Often when people talk about the energy transition, they talk about just wind and solar. That's obviously incredibly important. ENGIE, we're investing billions a year and are very confident that this is a huge opportunity for all of us. But really what you're seeing here is the system at the end has to work, and it's not going to be by one technology. You're going to have a balance here. Gas will be there for some time to deal with the intermittency of the renewables. And then, of course, over time, it's going to be incredibly important to work on the greening of gas. Today, much of it is still fossil, but France, as an example, has a target of a 10% biomethane target in 2030, which in energy terms is very quickly. And we believe that by 2050, all gas is going to be renewable gas. And I think, once you put it all together, and like it was mentioned earlier by John, there's so many technologies now available, and we should not bet our house or our planet on just one solution, because we will need a mix of things. The good news is there's trillions of dollars literally flowing into ESG funds, and so there's a lot of money available for investment. So if we create the right circumstances, the regulatory is of course incredibly important, like Ignacio just brought it up. And quite frankly, I am personally very confident that we can make this happen. But sense of urgency is what we need now. I think by 2030 we need to have all a target of reducing by half our CO2 emissions, and certainly that's our commitment at ENGIE.
Okay, we did promise the response from the word cloud, and we can check into it a little bit later as well. Let's bring that up now to see what our audience is thinking. And we're getting some questions from the audience as well. So what are the key expectations, your key expectations from COP26 to enable the global transition to net zero? Commitment to coal phase out, and this was a discussion. It was good that China gave that sort of commitment. Turning commitments into reality, to Ignacio's point here, we've got to be bolder. Energy transition pathway, acting earlier than 2050. We see a number of companies saying we'll be net zero by 2035. Some countries are trying to do the same thing. Speed, scale, net zero. Business leadership, which is obviously from ENGIE and from Iberdrola, is there at this stage. So very interesting, the feedback that we're getting. And finance for technology, and I'd like to pick up on that topic now if we can. David, I know President Biden said we've got this fund. Here's our commitment to it. The criticism of the developed world is that we have democracies and they're 4, 5, 6 year cycles on the election cycles. And then you know what's going to happen with the next leader. We saw what we had with President Trump, who's not even part of the Paris Climate Agreement. To Ignacio's point, how do we give clarity, line of sight, continuity to the developing world in your view, David?
Well, thanks, John. And really interesting word cloud that you just put up. And the ones that really stuck out to me is absolutely key are turning commitments to reality, and then the speed and scale. We've got to move with the speed and scale here that's unprecedented. And while we have made significant progress, as Ignacio and other panelists have said, and many others have spoken very eloquently about this, we've got to just move with that speed and pace and scale like we've never done before. Finance is absolutely key, John. Incredibly, as a U.S. citizen, incredibly gratifying to see the U.S. step up, the leadership by President Biden. And it's not just the speech that he made yesterday at the General Assembly. It's been the leadership that he's brought to the table from day one, rejoining the Paris Agreement, the climate summit that I think was incredibly helpful this spring to really keep that momentum, to put people on notice that everyone's paying attention to what commitments they put on the table during that point in time. I've had a chance to travel a few times with Secretary Kerry and all his phenomenal leadership around the world, really trying to make sure that this is a shared enterprise, all of us working together on those levels of commitment. Finance is key, of course, John. I think it's useful to think of finance a couple different ways. One is, and I go back to an earlier point, the more we can use our R&D levers, our other levers domestically and in collaboration with others to reduce those technology costs, that's a public good for everybody. If we're able to make progress in the US or Europe or India or elsewhere and reduce those costs for solar PV, that's going to allow more financing, more solar PV out into the market. So we need to focus on that technology cost part of it as we focus on the finance piece. And then the other point to make, I think, here is incredibly important for governments to step up. That's what President Biden was doing yesterday in terms of the commitments and the messages that he was sending. Our European colleagues, of course, and others stepping up on that front in terms of the public finance piece. But we've got to work hand in hand with investors, with the private sector, with companies. We need investment at such a scale. By some estimates, $23 trillion that we need for this clean energy transition, and that's probably a low estimate of what we actually need here. We need to have that finance from the private sector, from the investors, work with other governments on the enabling environments and other kinds of mechanisms to really get that flowing. We're starting to see that, but as has been clear already in this panel, we just need that pace and scale even further, including and especially on the finance front.
Well, the numbers are extraordinary, and I've seen even higher ones from ARENA, for example, here in the UAE, right up to $31 trillion by 2050. Let's take some questions from our audience, and I'll let everybody weigh in, and I'll call on you so you don't have to kind of shout through the box. What's the one policy intervention that could, in your opinion, really make a difference in speeding up the process of decarbonization? And I know this is not an easy question because you have European policy or national policy. For example, Mr. Galan in Spain, Judith, where you sit in Paris normally. But what is the one policy intervention that could, in your opinion, really make a difference in speeding up the process of decarbonization? Judith, you want to start?
Sure. I think the one thing that could make a huge difference is really to speed up coal exit. So we have in Europe, as you know, certain countries have given a 2030 target. Germany has given a 2038 target. There are certain countries who have not given any dates at all. It is quite outstanding that we're still having this debate, to be honest, because coal is, of course, the most polluting way of generating electricity. And given that we have so many options now on renewables, on green gas, like you said earlier, this would be the one thing that could make a huge difference very, very quickly. And so I think we should all commit to that and get our respective governments to go faster on this topic.
Okay, good. Again, that was a good sign from China, but they've been exporting plants pretty aggressively, especially into Africa. Mr. Galan, what did you say is the number one policy decision? You said you picked out a few in your opening remarks about tax policy, providing some incentives here. David alluded to that and the new technology to get it back into the market faster. The one policy recommendation was a question from our audience.
So I think Europe in the Fit for 55 is already contemplating several things, and I come again to the point of sense of urgency. I think they are already just planning to uniformize the European taxation of energy. It's a mess. Every country does whatever they like. So I think it's impossible to make anything because it depends on every country. Every country can do whatever. The second one, they're planning as well to make a directive for permitting. But I think they're planning to make that for 2024. I said another day to Ursula von der Leyen, to the president, I think 2024 is too late. When all this will be already completed, we'll be over the 2030. And another one is very important, is to keep the market rules, no intervention. I think there's something with David was saying, two words, which I think is very important for me, speed and scale. And I would like to put the example what the United States has already made with these two things. I think, we have been pioneers in this country in offshore. I think we've been during the previous administration for months and months and years postponing, delay the permits for making already the first offshore wind farm in this country. So the new administration came, within 2 months was done what has not been done in the last 4 years. The second one, they have already made something which is very important, scale. So they are already making auction at the same time, a huge auction, in such a way that they can attract the investor, not only investor, but as well industries. We can already provide wealth in the country because there are already enough critical mass for that. And the third one is finance. I think it's as well, finance means to reduce capex. You need already a certain level of scale. But I think something which is already commented, not very much. Everybody talk about the reduction of price of PV, which I think absolutely agree. But it's more important to have already cheap and easy access to transmission. So in most countries, the bottleneck is not because of the cost of the PV or the cost of the wind, which is a problem and we have to continue reducing. It's the difficulties to have already transmission and the cost that this transmission represents and the time it takes. I think we've been for the last 7 years to make an interconnection between Canada and Massachusetts. So it's plenty of litigations, continuous litigation, and it makes it impossible to bring the clean electricity from one part to another one. But the same thing to export electricity from New Mexico. I was yesterday there. From New Mexico, California, where they desperately need. It takes a long time. I think scale and finance. The finance is not only the cost of the renewable, it's the cost of all the things which are around, mostly transmission and distribution. We would like to achieve.
Okay, Mr. Galan.
Limits and market rules.
Okay, perfect. We have to just watch the length of our answers at this stage going forward because we have so many questions coming in from the audience at the same time. This raises a question I wanted to pepper our panel with. John Moore, one of the questions that came up is what role do you expect nuclear power to play in the future? The Minister of Energy from Bangladesh said that they're working on a plant right now and they want to tap into that cleaner energy. Upfront costs are high. The output is pretty low, but you have to stretch it out to pay it back over like 4 decades. Do you follow the money, John? What do you see here in terms of investment into the nuclear sector, and why is it not mentioned more when it comes to the transition?
Sure, a really great question. And so actually we looked at, in our last forecast, we looked at 3 different solutions, one of which was based around nuclear and actually using nuclear to create green hydrogen as one of the solutions for 2040s and 2050s. And so, it will depend really on the geography. It'll depend on the country view. Nuclear probably has a role. As we've said, there needs to be so much rollout that if you go down a pure path of, say, renewables and green hydrogen, the scale of build out is absolutely enormous for all of those technologies. If you look at sort of gas and CCS, again, the investment in CCS is enormous. So any pure approach is going to be difficult. So it'll really depend country by country where nuclear is acceptable and where nuclear can be a sort of piece of the solution, let's say. And I think that will be one of the areas where countries sort of will decide their own roadmaps depending on where they start today. It's not obvious that a lot will become new nuclear powers, but there's already a lot of nuclear around right now, and certainly that can be rolled forward and have a positive impact. So I think there'll be certain nuclear countries, let's say, that are using nuclear to generate green hydrogen and those kinds of things.
The other question I wanted to present to you is, because we're looking for solutions here, and I'd love to have our panel. David Turk, you can talk about it because of the role of the U.S. as shareholders in the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Asian Investment Infrastructure Fund, AIIB, of course, African Development Bank. Shouldn't we have a more aggressive mandate for these development banks to really make it fly and say that this should be our #1 concentration over the next 10 to 20 years? It seems like we're kind of crawling to the process. David, is that a fair criticism?
So there's no doubt, John, we need to do a whole lot more in a whole lot of areas. And to the earlier question on what single policy or this technology or that technology or this finance mechanism or that finance mechanism, the short answer is we need a whole lot more of a whole lot more policy, technology, and on the finance side. So I think your point's an excellent one. We need to be thinking about the World Bank. We need to be thinking about the regional development banks. We need to be leveraging them as much as we possibly can. We've had a lot of discussion in the U.S. government, not only with our Treasury colleagues who coordinate our relationship with those banks, those regional banks and the World Bank, but I've had personal discussions with the head of USAID, our bilateral development agency, Samantha Power, who's very passionate on these issues. And I'm convinced there's a lot more we can be doing from the USAID side of things and other countries bilaterally in terms of helping other countries move on the mitigation side and help on the adaptation side. We've got the DFC, which does a lot of international deals. We can leverage that further to get even more benefit. But we have to take a step back, appreciate how much we have to do to fundamentally transform our energy economies in a very, very short amount of time to be consistent with the IPCC, the experts, our scientific consensus, and what we're seeing around us with wildfires, droughts, and other kinds of things. So we just need a whole lot more of a whole lot of instruments, policy instruments, finance instruments, and technology levers as well.
Okay, I don't want to be the doomsayer, but as I was saying, I was sitting on a panel with ministers of energy from Nigeria, Bangladesh, Indonesia, very populated developing countries. Indonesia's coal demand, because there's so much growth right now post-pandemic, shot up, and they're still searching for gas. They've got major IOCs, or international energy companies, in Indonesia exploring for gas right now. What do we do about the very populated countries of the world, India in particular, which needs the financing, Indonesia, Nigeria, Bangladesh, which are kind of wedded to either coal or other hydrocarbons right now? Judith, you work in these countries as NG. What's the best solution here?
I mean, you bring up a good point, John. There isn't one solution that fits all, and certain of these countries still depend on coal. But, again, like I said earlier, collectively, we need to move towards more renewables and complement it with gas. We have at ENGIE decided to exit coal. We have reduced our CO2 by 50% already in the last 5 years. We're going to have to do another 50% in the next until 2030. And I think if we all collectively put our minds to it, then we can make it happen. So, to be concrete in these countries, renewables is equally important. Some of these countries have a lot of sun, so to create green hydrogen, because often you will need gas, including on transportation often, and electricity production. Those are some of the options that we need to look at. Dave mentioned it earlier, we need to get the cost curves down on some of these technologies still. And certainly what we can do also in the developed countries is really to work on those cost curves so we can then deploy it in the countries that need it the most and that have the highest energy needs, the growing energy needs, of course, because of their population growth. So local renewables, local green hydrogen, the transportation that comes with it, all of that technologically is possible. And of course, we're going to have to tap into some of the financial instruments that you've seen, because as private that you've mentioned, because as private companies, we need to have, a certain security around our investments and, of course, the returns that come with it. And that, quite frankly, in some of the more complex countries, we will need some support from the financial institutions.
Okay, I want to ask the team from the World Economic Forum to bring back up that word cloud and see if it's altered through our conversations here. Ignacio, I'd love to get your thoughts coming out of COP26. What do you want to hear to address these major emerging markets? We shouldn't be debating about a green energy fund and lacking commitments. Number one, U.S. and China. Can this energy and the energy transition and climate change be the unifying policy between the U.S. and China? Ignacio, give us that in about a minute, because we're a little bit tight on time. You're muted there, Ignacio.
I will say something about the previous question. I think the first thing we have to convince the emerging countries that today capex in solar or capex in wind is cheaper than capex in coal or capex in a combined cycle of gas. So I think they need less capital for generating. The second one, I think they can already make themselves self-sufficient. They will not depend on the import of other countries. So I think these two things is important. The third one is related financing. I think it's a big change, a big improvement in the financing. The green bonds are there. So I think today, many companies, we have access to green bonds. I think Iberdrola, we are one of the leaders in issuing green bonds. More than $40 billion already have for issuing green bonds. But what is the problem of achieving the green bonds? I come again, stability, predictability, clear rule of law. And that is what we have to request to the countries, to have access to that one, because the money is available, but I think those ones which are putting money for 40, 50, 60 years, they are asking for stability, predictability, clear rule, not changing the rules at the middle of the match, etc. So what we are expecting on COP26, the first one, we are the main sponsor of COP. So I think we are already, our headquarters in Britain and in Glasgow, all of you are invited to come there. It's a beautiful office, and I'm sure that we will, a part of the conclusion, we can already enjoy a wonderful time there with the Glasgow people is very, very nice, and I think we can already make it. I think what I expect, I'm always optimistic. I was starting saying, I've been already attending the COPs in Copenhagen, so I see how the world has evolved in this period, how the people is already understanding, because of the civil society pressure, that things have to be done. So, and I'm sure that Glasgow is going to be as well another step forward on this one. I think the main problem will be who is going to finance the renewable expansion in the emerging countries. But I think everybody is like the pandemic. I think it's something which is affecting to everybody. If all of us, we are not doing all the necessary, so therefore we are making one part of the plan and is affecting to another part of the plan. So it's a common effort to try to solve the situation. And I'm sure that is the point. That's why I come to my point. It's very important that those countries, what we have already made the leadership, European Union, in this moment, United States, will be very consistent in our policies. We cannot change the rules just because of temporary situation. We can already affect to the market. If we are intervening in the energy market, if we are changing the taxation rules, if we are already just not providing stability, who is going to trust that our model is the correct one? So for me, that is the main thing. We have to provide already a real good path for those which have to follow our line. If not, our strategy, nobody will believe in us. So I think that for me is very important. I'm optimistic because the social, the young people especially, that is the main thing that they are arguing when you talk with them. The climate change is at the top of their priorities. And we, those we have the responsibility in running the companies or running the countries, we have to provide already a solution for them. And I'm sure that is going to happen. Glasgow is a good place for already just trying to achieve this one. Only you are invited to come.
Ignacio, I like your optimism because the world needs a rally at this period. I have a question for both John Moore and Judith, the same question, then I'm going to conclude with David Turk. For John and Judith, the impact of environmental social governance, we saw a lot of different proclamations from major fund managers saying that you cannot be invested or have that exposure to hydrocarbons and take money from us, basically, is the bottom line. So should we follow the money on Wall Street, the City of London and Frankfurt, the major capitals like Paris? And if you track it, John, is it having an influence on where the money's flowing? And does that model need to be applied to the developing world at the same time? Judith, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the impact ESG's had on the makeup of NG as well. Let's start with John.
Thank you. So, I mean, there's certainly been a huge, massive uptick in ESG. So we're already had more inflows this year, year to date, than we had in the whole of last year. And things like sustainable debt, we've already had as much in half one of this year than we had in the whole of the prior year. And the 3 years before that, it had already trebled. So the good news is there really is money flowing in. There's a lot of commitments being made. So now 70% of emissions are covered by some form of government commitment. So that's another good thing. So people are setting targets. I think the gap we have to close is really the implementation gap, how to deploy those funds, where to deploy those funds. And that's where I think it needs to be looked at on a country-by-country basis, because every country will have a different path, and every country will need to sort of invite investors in, using the right policies, having the right goals, adopting the right standards. So there's something called TCFD, which is a standard for climate reporting that investors will look at. So again, adopting those standards is a way of attracting foreign investors. So the money is there, but you have to attract it in with great targets, good standards to really get that deployed in the right way.
Okay, very good. Judith, for you, because we're a little bit tight on time here, 1 minute, then I'll ask for the same from David Turk, please.
No, so the ESG is, there's literally trillions. Every time we talk, there's a trillion more, basically, quite frankly, flowing into this. I think the way I distinguish is equity funding, debt, and then on the project level. And I think we're not fully there yet. On the green bonds, I agree with Ignacio, since his company and mine are the global leaders on green bonds with close to 14 billion each that we've been able to issue. I think that's, for me, the most obvious, because you can really tag it to specific projects. When you look at the rest, though, there is many initiatives that are all very good initiatives, but there's no common language yet. And so what we're seeing is that there's a lot of money going into renewable pure players on their stocks, and you have very high multiples that come with it. But surely that cannot be the solution, right? It's not going to be like 3 companies on their own that are going to make this planet work when it comes to energy. And so collectively, we need to commit to transparency. I think we have like 2-3 years here, really important to find a common language that investors can really distinguish and follow the ones that mean it. Have a zero carbon date, yes, but have intermittent, dates also of where you're committed to reduction and so on, and really think as companies We need to commit to that, and as investors, we need to get more sophisticated to be able to read. Just like we read a company's balance sheet, we need to get more sophisticated on reading ESG to really place that money. Because I do believe, I'm quite optimistic actually, that money will be available, but right now it's too concentrated in very few places. When of course it's a global need, and we all need to be able to invest and to use these funds to move the energy planet forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very precise in what you're saying. Let's bring up the word cloud one more time, and then I'm going to present the question to Deputy Secretary Turk. The question to our audience was, what are your key expectations from COP26 to enable the global transition to net zero? And you can see the expansion of some of these key phrases here. Commitment to coal phase out. And that's not taking place in many parts of the world, as I was noting there. Turning commitments to reality, energy transition pathway that has to be clear, to Judith Hartmann's point here. Acting earlier than 2050. And I know there's a lot of pressure for the next generation saying, geez, the baby boomers, you guys have been asleep at the wheel. Why didn't you wake up to the challenge earlier? To Ignacio's point, it has to get done at COP26. And what is a real energy transition? David Turk, we've been talking about the developing world. I'm just very concerned that they're moving at a slower pace and they need some support. For you at COP26, what's a success that we walk away and say, you know what, we are tackling those who need the financing most, and we have these mechanisms in place? What's realistic from Glasgow?
I think that the key thing, John, I took from the word cloud, and I think what we need to keep our eye on the ball is the real world. What's happening in the real world? The word cloud had action, it had early action. I think that's what we really need to be focused on, is what is actually happening in the real world, not just in the US and in Europe, but just as you said, John, in India, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. I was just in India a few weeks ago to talk with our Indian colleagues, 5 or 6 different ministries there. What could we do sharing expertise? What could we do collaborating to try to help us all move forward as quickly as we can? In the real world, I think we've got a 2 to 3 year window of time here where we either step up and are serious about implementing these technologies with the policy levers, with the finance levers at scale that puts us on, again, as the word cloud said, that trajectory, that pathway to net zero going forward. And if we don't do that in this next couple year period of time as we come out of the COVID crisis, as our president has said, we can't just build back, we need to build back better. And I think this next couple year window of time coming out of Glasgow with the commitments on ambition, incredibly important. But we've got a lot of work to do. No doubt all of us need to roll up our sleeves on this panel and many others out there and get to work on those impacts in the real world.
Okay, so all the members on this panel, which I'm sure will be in Glasgow, don't let them walk away, and I'll be there as well. Don't let them walk away without a deal is what we need to do. We need a commitment across the board. What a fantastic group. I appreciate the audience participation on the word cloud, and we couldn't get to all the questions, but they were all very robust. Obviously, people that tracked this very carefully. Judith Hartmann of NJ, good to see you again. Ignacio Galan, it's always great to have your expertise. John Moore putting the money flows from Bloomberg Nefs into the context that we needed here between hydrocarbons and renewables. And David Turk, couldn't ask for a better government voice in terms of breaking down the realities of today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.